We're going to turn now to Iran. Still a dominating story, the war that seems to never end because the U.S. won't stop. This U.S.-Israeli war continues to escalate even as negotiations over possible settlement remain alive. And yesterday we saw that the Iranians reportedly they threatened to suspend these indirect talks with Washington, citing continued Israeli attacks on Lebanon, insisting that any ceasefire must apply on all fronts, not just to Iran. Meanwhile, Trump is claiming that diplomacy is still moving forward, even as the U.S. and Iranian forces continue exchanging strikes. And tensions remain quite high across the region, as they have for the last 3 months. In fact, I believe we've now passed the 3-month threshold of this war. So for more, we're joined by Professor Mohammad Marandi, who is an expert in American studies at the University of Tehran. Professor Marandi, welcome to our debut episode of Breakthrough News Live. It's great to see you.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a great pleasure.
Well, it's the developments continue to change like every hour as more things happen with these indirect negotiations. But I wanted to start off by asking you about Iran's recent retaliations with regard to the Gulf states, because the Arab Gulf states, because the U.S. and Iran, they have continued to exchange fire, especially in the last couple of weeks, despite these ongoing indirect negotiations. And when the U.S. strikes Iran has basically repeatedly retaliated against locations connected to the American military presence in the Gulf, but particularly in Kuwait and the UAE. So I just wanted to ask, why is there a specific focus on these two states, and what message is Iran trying to send here?
As you know, all 5 regimes in the Persian Gulf, meaning Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, and the Emirates, they were complicit in the war against Iran. They hosted U.S. bases. They allowed the United States to use those bases and to use their airspace to strike Iran. And of course, on day one, they helped the United States slaughter 168 little girls in an elementary school in the city of Minab, along with a couple of dozen of teachers and school staff. So that's why the Iranians retaliated against the United States in these countries. They struck their bases, but also when the U.S. or the Israeli regime would strike Iranian critical infrastructure or the country's civilian infrastructure, Iran would strike the Israeli regime's infrastructure, but also the infrastructure of the regimes that were hosting U.S. bases and facilitating U.S. strikes. The 2 regimes that right now are helping the United States more than any other are Kuwait and the Emirates. They host a significant amount of U.S. land forces. All of the countries host U.S. assets right now that are prepared to launch an attack against Iran. But the UAE and Kuwait have a contingent of Marines and ground forces that could be used against Iran. So they are a particular threat to the country, and their territory has been used to strike Iranian targets during these unprovoked attacks by the Americans. So the focus for Iran has been retaliating against the United States and against these 2 regimes.
It's been a couple of weeks, maybe even now over months, of these circular talks regarding a possible deal. Kind of like every week we're like, oh, we might be getting a deal, or we may get a resumption of war. And so what actually would be necessary for Iran to accept a deal? What would make this settlement credible? Because we know that the biggest fear and what's really on the table is a deal being struck, a ceasefire being established, and then U.S. and Israel coming in a couple months, maybe 6 months, maybe a year, and attacking again.
Well, for the time being, the first stage of any agreement would have to bring an end to the siege on the Strait of Hormuz by the Americans, a complete end to the siege. It would have to mean that the Israeli regime leaves Lebanon and no longer carries out attacks or assassinations in the country. It would also mean that the United States would waive sanctions for Iranian oil and gas exports during this 2-month period of time. And it would also mean that the United States has to release immediately half of Iranian stolen assets, which is roughly $12 billion. Over the years, the United States has stolen roughly $24 billion of Iranian assets. So half of those have to be handed over to the Iranians. So this is, and also the ceasefire in Gaza has to be enforced.
And of course, it's like, how do you end up guaranteeing that? And that's the big question. But I know we're on limited time with you, and I wanted to give you a chance to answer something that I'm curious what you'd have to say to this. Because when this war began, many people predicted that Iran would quickly collapse under military and economic and political pressure. That clearly hasn't happened. And Professor Marandi, we've had you on the show and we've discussed why that hasn't happened. But 3 months into this conflict, I wanted to ask you if you think there is a winner and or a loser, and if so, who and why?
I think the big loser is the United States. They were defeated militarily, and because of the siege on the Persian Gulf, they've also strangled the global economy, and the global economy is heading for a cliff, and so is the U.S. economy, and that is not going to end well for Trump. But I think besides the United States being the big loser, in reality, the Israeli regime is also a big loser, because after almost 3 years of genocide and turning the entire world against itself, now the Israeli regime is starving the world of energy because it refuses to allow the United States to sign an agreement with Iran. And it has been preventing this agreement, which could have been signed almost 2 months ago now, well over a month and a half ago. So as the world goes downhill, as the situation gets worse, and every day that this siege continues, it's going to intensify the crisis, and it will definitely lead to a recession. But now I think if this lasts much longer, a couple of months, it will lead to a global economic depression without a renewal of a military conflict. Just if we have this stalemate for a couple more months, I think we'll have a global economic depression. But the world is going to blame the Israeli regime. But the reason why the regime continues down this foolish path is because Netanyahu needs crises, and his political allies, they don't care what happens to the rest of the world. But I have colleagues in India, for example. And India had a traditionally pro-Israeli position under Modi. And according to polls, the majority of Indians supported the Israeli regime. Mm-hmm. Now, the majority of Indians do not support the Israeli regime. And that means a large segment of the Hindu population does not support the regime. One reason for it is that the regime is the cause of the growing economic crisis in India. In other words, the Zionists have no regard for India or Indians, nor do they have any regard for Argentina or Uganda or any of those countries where they have a sizable support base for whatever reason. And that is, I think, that is going to hurt the regime much more than they can really imagine.
And Professor Marandi, before we let you go, just want to ask one last question. In a lot of ways, the nuclear question has come up, of course, over the past decade with U.S.-Iranian relations. And Iran has consistently said it does not want to pursue a nuclear weapon. Its nuclear weapons program, its nuclear program is peaceful, but it does have the right to enrich uranium. However, there has been sort of a increased evidence that maybe it is important to have nuclear deterrence because countries that do have it are not getting attacked. Does this calculation change? And does Tehran still believe that it has conventional capabilities, regional alliances, and control over strategic choke points like the Strait of Hormuz that allow it to have sufficient deterrence now And why is Iran holding so firmly to its right to have enriched uranium, even amid intense military pressure?
Well, the Islamic Revolution 47 years ago was about sovereignty and independence and dignity and honor and support for the oppressed across the globe. And so there's no chance that this movement, that this state is going to accept the United States or the Europeans taking away their sovereign right. Iran is a member of the NPT, and it has signed the NPT. It's a member of the International Atomic Energy Agency, and it has not violated any of the laws or the regulations that it has signed up to. So they see no reason why they should give up any of their sovereignty.
Mm-hmm.
Iran is probably the most fiercely independent country on this planet, and we see Iran's support for the Palestinians, partially because Iran is not cowed by the West, and partially because of its ideology, where it has to support the oppressed across the board. That's why Iran supports Venezuela and Cuba and so on, and it supported the resistance against apartheid South Africa. But after the 12-day war, where last year, which we're almost on the anniversary of that war, where the United States and the Israeli regime launched a blitzkrieg attack against Iran, public opinion, despite the state's opposition to nuclear weapons, public opinion shifted, and the majority of the public support having nuclear weapons. I haven't seen recent polling in Iran, but I would imagine that a significant majority today still supports the government, the state, producing nuclear weapons. But the policy continues to be that we do not want nuclear weapons for a host of reasons. One is moral. During the war where the West supported Saddam Hussein to invade Iran, and the United States pushed Saddam to invade, and these Arab regimes in the Persian Gulf supported Saddam back then too, gave him hundreds of billions of dollars, and the Germans gave him chemical weapons with the support of the West and the US. I survived 2 chemical attacks. At that time, when Saddam Hussein was using chemical weapons extensively against Iranians and against his own people, in one attack he killed 6,500 Iraqis in northern Iraq in a Kurdish city called Halabja and in the surrounding areas. And the West had no problem with that. People went to Ayatollah Khomeini, the first leader of the revolution, and said we need to produce chemical weapons. And he said no, he refused to give them permission. He said it's immoral and we're not going to produce them. So Iran does have a history of opposing weapons of mass destruction, whereas the West has a history of producing them, using them, and giving them to others to use them as well.
Well, Professor Mohammad Marandi, I know you got other things you got to get to, but we really, really appreciate you joining us and breaking all this down, and hope to see you again soon. Stay safe out there.
Thank you very much for having me. Have a very good day.